Captain Daniel Brooks stood on the bridge of the Earth defense ship Valiant and looked at the stars through the main window. His ship had been on a simple patrol mission near the Kepler sector for 3 weeks now, and nothing unusual had happened during that time. The crew was relaxed and everyone was doing their regular duties without any stress or concern. Lieutenant Maya Johnson sat at her communication station and checked the incoming messages like she did every hour. She was a young officer, with only 2 years of experience, but she was very good at her job and Daniel trusted her completely. Suddenly, Maya went completely still in her seat and her fingers stopped moving across her console. Daniel noticed the change in her body language immediately, because he had been a captain for 15 years and he knew when something was wrong. He walked across the bridge toward her station, and his boots made soft sounds on the metal floor. Maya looked up at him with wide eyes and her face had gone pale. She spoke in a quiet voice that was almost a whisper. Daniel could hear the concern in her tone, and he felt his own heart rate increase slightly. Maya told him they were receiving an encrypted transmission from an unknown source. She explained that the encryption was using old Galactic Council cipher protocols that had supposedly been discontinued decades ago. Daniel felt a cold sensation run down his spine because unauthorized transmissions in this remote sector were extremely rare, and encrypted ones were even more unusual. He asked Maya if she could crack the encryption and break through to see what the message contained. Maya worked on her console for several minutes and her fingers moved quickly across the controls. She tried different approaches and used various decryption tools, but nothing seemed to work at first. The encryption was fighting back against every attempt she made to break it. However, Maya noticed something interesting about the code structure. She turned to Daniel and told him that whoever sent this message actually wanted it to be found by someone with council-level access. She suggested that Lieutenant Commander Greg Patterson might have the authorization codes they needed because he used to work in diplomatic services. Greg looked up from the tactical station where he had been monitoring the ship's weapons systems. His weathered face showed concern and confusion. He was older than most of the crew at 45 years old, and he had served in various positions during his military career. Before joining the Valiant, he had worked as a diplomatic liaison during the treaty negotiations between Earth and several alien species. He told Daniel that he still had his old diplomatic credentials stored in the ship's computer system. He said he could try using those codes to unlock the message. Greg moved to Maya's station and stood beside her. He input various authorization sequences that he remembered from his diplomatic days. Each attempt failed and the console made negative sounds. Greg tried different combinations and used backup codes that he had almost forgotten about. Minutes passed slowly and the tension on the bridge increased with each failed attempt. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the console made a different sound. It was a positive chime that indicated success. A file began to decrypt on the screen, and everyone on the bridge moved closer to see what it contained. What appeared on the screen made every person on the bridge fall completely silent. It was a video recording of a Galactic Council chamber, but it was not the public chamber that humanity had been invited to for normal diplomatic meetings. This was a different place entirely. The chamber was enormous and filled with representatives from species across known space. Daniel recognized many of them from his diplomatic briefings. There were the insectoid Xanthir with their hard shells and multiple eyes. There were the crystalline Vex who looked like living glass sculptures. There were the towering Karathi who stood 3 meters tall. There were dozens of other species that Daniel had seen before in diplomatic contexts. At the center of the chamber stood a podium and behind it was Counselor Vren. He was a senior member of the Xanthir hierarchy, and Daniel had met him once at a trade conference. Vren's translated voice came through the speakers clearly. The translation software converted his clicking sounds into human language. Vren spoke in a calm and measured tone that made his words even more chilling. He said the motion was clear and simple. He stated that humanity had progressed too rapidly for the comfort of the other species. He claimed their technological advancement and military expansion and their very nature posed an existential threat to galactic stability. He declared that the Council could not allow humans to continue unchecked. Another counselor spoke up in response to Vren's statement. This one was a Vex named Crystalline Speaker Thane. His body pulsed with agitated light patterns that indicated strong emotion. Thane pointed out that Vren was speaking of erasure, not just a simple quarantine or economic sanction. He stated clearly that Vren was proposing the systematic elimination of an entire species. His words hung in the air and caused murmurs among the assembled representatives. Vren responded without hesitation or apparent emotion. He said he was proposing survival for the rest of the galaxy. He explained that their projections showed that within 50 cycles, humanity would possess weapons capable of challenging even the eldest civilizations. He called humans aggressive and unpredictable. He said they refused to accept their proper place in the natural galactic order. He argued it was better to act now than face extinction later. The recording showed the actual vote taking place. Species after species cast their decision into the official record. The voting system displayed each choice on a large screen visible to everyone in the chamber. Daniel watched in growing horror as the numbers climbed higher and higher. When the final tally appeared on screen, the result was absolutely devastating. 847 species had voted in favor of systematic population reduction protocols. 203 had voted against the measure. 94 had chosen to abstain from voting entirely. The council had voted to erase humanity from existence. Maya's voice broke the terrible silence that had fallen over the bridge. She spoke in barely more than a whisper, and asked why they were only seeing this recording now. The timestamp on the video showed it had been recorded 8 months ago. Greg's voice was grim when he answered her question. He said that someone on the council must have grown a conscience after participating in or witnessing the vote. He pointed to the metadata attached to the file, which showed the message had been leaked by an internal source. The file had been routed through a dozen different proxy servers before finally reaching the Valiant. Daniel felt like ice water was flowing through his veins instead of blood. 8 months had passed since this vote happened. For 8 months, the galaxy had been planning humanity's destruction while maintaining normal diplomatic relations. Alien ambassadors had been trading with Earth colonies and signing treaties and shaking hands at official ceremonies. They had smiled and talked about cooperation and mutual benefit, all while secretly planning to exterminate every human in existence. Daniel gave orders in a voice that sounded calmer than he felt. He told Maya to establish contact with Admiral Kyle Murphy at Earth Command using their quantum communication channel with maximum encryption. He told the crew to find out who had sent them this recording, because they needed to verify its authenticity before it went public. Lieutenant Sophie Mitchell spoke up from the science station. Her voice was shaking when she asked the question that everyone was thinking. If this recording was real, then why had nothing happened yet? Why were they all still alive and going about their normal duties? Daniel looked at the frozen image of Counselor Vren on the screen. That insectoid face showed no emotion and no hesitation about proposing the genocide of billions of beings. Daniel said quietly that maybe the council was still planning the details of their attack. Or maybe someone had been fighting back against the plan without humanity knowing about it. Either way, they needed answers immediately, and they needed them from the highest levels of Earth's government, the Valiants. Engines hummed with increased power as Daniel ordered a course back to Earth at maximum speed. Behind them in space, the encrypted message continued its journey through secure channels. It reached other human ships patrolling different sectors. It reached colony administrators on distant worlds. It reached intelligence operatives working undercover in alien societies. Within hours, the secret would spread throughout human space. Within days, every human in the galaxy would know that the Council had voted for their extinction, and the galaxy would have to answer for what they had planned. The emergency session of Earth's United Assembly convened within 12 hours of the Valiant's transmission reaching home. Representatives from every major colony and settlement had gathered in the massive chamber, either in person or through holographic projection. The atmosphere was tense and filled with anger and fear. Admiral Kyle Murphy stood at the central podium before the gathered representatives, and the verified recording played on screens positioned around the chamber. Every person in the room watched in silence as Counselor Vren proposed humanity's extinction, and as the vote was counted. Admiral Kyle spoke in a heavy voice that carried the weight of what they had all just witnessed. He told the assembly that they had confirmed the recording's authenticity through multiple verification methods. The encryption matched Council security protocols perfectly down to the smallest details. Their intelligence assets scattered across various alien worlds had verified the identities of every counselor visible in that chamber. The vote had actually happened, and it had happened while those same counselors were negotiating trade agreements with Earth for the Rigel sector. Ambassador, Lisa Grant sat in the front row and her face had gone completely pale. She was Earth's senior diplomat to the Galactic Council, and she had spent years building relationships with alien representatives. She spoke up and told the assembly that she had been meeting with Councillor Vren just 3 weeks earlier. They had discussed expanded cultural exchange programs between humans and the Xanthir. Vren had looked her directly in the eyes and talked enthusiastically about their shared future and mutual cooperation. Her voice became harder as she continued. She said that all the while he had been planning their extinction with cold calculation. General Nathan Cole, who headed Earth's defense forces, asked if they knew who had leaked the recording. Commander Jake Russell stood up to answer the question. He was Earth's chief intelligence officer, and he had spent the last several hours tracing the message back through its complicated path. Jake explained that they had traced the transmission back through 17 different proxy servers. The source had covered their tracks very well using sophisticated methods. However, his team had found fragments of data that revealed the origin point. The leak had come from within the Xanthir diplomatic corps, and specifically from a junior attaché named Krell, who worked in the council archives. Ambassador. Lisa asked the obvious next question about where this Krell was now. Jake's expression darkened and became grim. He told them that Krell was dead. His body had been found in his personal quarters 2 days after the transmission had been sent. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure in the Xanthir medical report. However, Jake pointed out that Xanthir physiology did not include hearts in the way humans understood them. They did not have heart attacks. Someone had silenced Krell permanently to prevent him from revealing more information. The chamber erupted into angry voices as representatives shouted questions and demands. Representative Helen Torres, who headed the Colonial Affairs Committee, stood up, and her voice cut through the noise. She stated firmly that they needed to go public immediately with this information. Every human colony and settlement and ship needed to know what the Council had planned for them. She argued that keeping this secret would be a betrayal of the people they represented. Admiral Kyle raised his hand to quiet the chamber. He cautioned that going public would risk open war with the Council. The Council commanded the combined military might of over 1,000 species. Humanity had only 50 colonies and a defense fleet that was barely 20 years old. They would be massively outnumbered in any direct military confrontation. Helen turned to face Kyle directly. She demanded to know what he proposed instead. Should they keep quiet while the Council continued planning their genocide? Should they pretend everything was normal while alien diplomats smiled and plotted their deaths? Her voice was filled with frustration and righteous anger. President Claire Anderson spoke for the first time since the session had begun. Her voice was calm but carried absolute authority. She told the assembly that they would not keep quiet, but they would investigate first. They needed to find out everything about the vote. Who had voted yes and who had voted no? What specific implementation plans had been made? Most importantly, they needed to understand why the genocide had not been executed yet. Claire gestured toward the screen where Councillor Vren's face was frozen. She pointed out that 847 species had voted to eliminate humanity, but humans were still alive. Something had stopped the plan or delayed its execution. They needed to know what that something was before they could respond effectively. Lisa leaned forward in her seat. She told the president that she had contacts throughout the council. Some counselors she had thought were genuine allies and friends. Species like the Delothians and the Mirren Collective, and even some Vex splinter groups had always seemed supportive of humanity. If any of them had voted against the extinction measure, they might be willing to talk privately. They might provide crucial information about what was happening behind the scenes. President Claire nodded and told Lisa to reach out to those contacts, but to do so very carefully. She did not want to alert the council that humanity knew about the vote until they were ready. She turned to Jake and told him she wanted full intelligence sweeps conducted on every council species. His team needed to identify who their real enemies were and who might become potential allies. General Nathan asked about military readiness. Claire told him to increase their defensive capabilities, but to do it quietly, without drawing attention. She ordered him to recall their deep space exploratory fleets back to human-controlled space. He should fortify their major colonies with additional defenses. They should begin production of new orbital defense platforms, but disguise it as standard system upgrades that had been previously scheduled. Admiral Kyle asked about informing the public. Claire was silent for a long moment as she considered the question carefully. She finally said that they could not keep this secret for very long. Someone would leak the information or the council would realize that humanity knew about the vote. Either scenario would force their hand. However, they needed time to prepare their people and position their assets. She gave them 2 weeks to get everything in place, and then they would release the full recording to the public. Over the next 14 days, Earth's intelligence network operated at maximum capacity. Operatives across the galaxy began making discreet inquiries and following money trails. They intercepted communications between alien governments. They cultivated new sources within various species administrations. Commander Jake Russell worked around the clock coordinating all these efforts. He assembled information piece by piece like putting together an enormous puzzle. Jake discovered that the vote had not been unanimous even within individual species. Several alien civilizations had experienced fierce internal debates about the extinction proposal. The Karathi military caste had voted in favor of eliminating humanity. However, their science caste had opposed the measure strongly. The Delothians had chosen to abstain entirely from the vote. Their entire delegation had walked out of the chamber in protest rather than participate. More disturbing information emerged as Jake dug deeper into council records that his operatives had accessed. The council had formed a secret committee immediately after the vote. This committee was called the Stabilization Protocol, and it was chaired by Councillor Vren himself. The committee's sole purpose was determining the most efficient method of eliminating humanity from the galaxy. Jake found detailed proposals that the committee had developed. They had considered engineering biological plagues specifically designed to target human genetics. They had planned coordinated military strikes against all major human colonies simultaneously. They had designed economic warfare strategies meant to cause colony collapse through resource starvation. Each option had been carefully modeled and analyzed. They had run war games simulating different scenarios. They had calculated effectiveness ratings and deniability factors for each approach. Jake reported his findings to President Claire in a private meeting. He told her that the council had treated the planned genocide like any other bureaucratic project. They had conducted cost-benefit analyses and risk assessments. They had created timeline projections and resource allocation charts. They were planning to murder 8 billion human beings with the same clinical detachment they would use to plan a tax policy revision. However, the most crucial discovery came from an unexpected source. A low-level translator working in the Myron Collective's diplomatic mission reached out through back channels. Her name was Rachel Kim, and she was a human woman who had married into Myron society years ago. Her encrypted message reached Jake's team after passing through secure networks. Rachel's message contained vital information. She wrote that there was a resistance movement working inside the council. Not all the counselors who had voted yes were truly committed to the extinction plan. Some had been coerced into voting that way. Others had been blackmailed with threats against their own species. More importantly, there was a counterfaction actively fighting the implementation from within the council itself. This group had been sabotaging the stabilization protocol at every turn. They had corrupted research data and misdirected resources and caused delays. However, Rachel did not know how much longer. They could continue holding out against Vren's faction. Jake stared at the message for a long time before forwarding it to President Claire and Admiral Kyle. The galaxy was not completely united against humanity after all. Somewhere out there, aliens were risking their lives to save human civilization. The question now was whether their efforts would be enough to prevent what was coming. The broadcast went out simultaneously across every human colony and station and ship in settled space. President Claire Anders' face appeared on screens in homes and bars and ships and public squares across dozens of worlds. She had chosen to address her species directly, without any intermediaries or diplomatic language. Her voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal to billions of people. Claire began by telling her fellow humans that she was speaking about a threat to their very existence. She described it as a betrayal of trust that struck at the heart of everything they believed about their place in the galaxy. She did not soften her words or try to minimize the impact. The recording played immediately after her introduction. Every human alive watched as Councillor Vren proposed their erasure in that secret chamber. They watched as species after species voted for their extinction. They watched as the Galactic Council coldly debated the most efficient means of committing genocide against 8 billion people. The reaction was immediate and explosive across human space. On Mars colony, riots broke out within an hour of the broadcast. Protesters stormed the Galactic Trade Commission building and smashed windows and overturned furniture. Security forces barely prevented them from reaching the 3 alien diplomats who were trapped inside their offices. Similar scenes played out on Europa Station, where angry crowds surrounded the Xanthir embassy. In New Seattle on Proxima B, the local population forced every alien resident to evacuate the city within 6 hours. A dozen other colonies experienced violence and property destruction as humans vented their rage and fear. Captain Daniel Brooks watched from the Valiant as his crew struggled to process what they had learned. The ship had returned to Earth orbit and was now part of the defensive perimeter around humanity's homeworld. Lieutenant Maya Johnson sat at her communication station monitoring channels that were flooding with messages. Tears streamed down her face as she listened to the voices of frightened colonists and angry civilians. She whispered that the Council had been going to kill them all. She said they were planning to murder men and women and children. She repeated that they wanted to erase every human in existence from the galaxy. Lieutenant Commander Greg Patterson spoke gently to Maya. He reminded her that the genocide had not happened yet. Humans were still alive, and that fact meant something important. It meant there was still hope and still time to fight back. His words helped calm Maya slightly, but the fear remained in her eyes. Within hours, human ships across the galaxy began receiving messages from various sources. Some messages were threats from alien extremists who openly supported the Council's extinction vote. These messages said that humanity was a plague that needed to be removed. They claimed humans were dangerous animals that did not deserve to exist among civilized species. However, other messages were completely different in tone and content. A transmission arrived at the Valiant from a Delothian freighter captain named Vosh. His message was brief but significant. He stated clearly that not all aliens had agreed with the vote. He explained that his people had walked out of the council chamber rather than participate in what they considered evil. He told the humans that they had allies in the galaxy who would stand with them. A Vex scientist named Resonance Pattern 7 sent detailed files to Earth Command. These files showed how a counterfaction within the council had been systematically sabotaging the stabilization protocol's research efforts. They had corrupted data files and misdirected resources and created false reports. Every action was designed to slow down or prevent the implementation of humanity's extinction. Even some Karathi reached out despite their military caste having voted for the measure. Messages came from their science caste explaining that they had opposed their own military leaders on this issue. One message stated clearly that extinction was not stability. It argued that genocide was chaos wearing the mask of order. These Karathi scientists wanted humans to know that not everyone in their civilization agreed with the vote. However, the most significant response came from the Galactic Council itself. Counselor Vren appeared on galactic broadcast channels that reached billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. His translated voice was calm and measured as always. He acknowledged that the recently leaked recording had caused significant concern among the human population. He stated that he wanted to assure everyone that this matter was being taken very seriously by the Council. Admiral Kyle Murphy watched the broadcast from Earth Command. He growled angrily when Vren referred to planned genocide as simply a matter. The casual dismissal of such a monstrous act infuriated him beyond words. Vren continued his statement by explaining the context of the vote. He claimed that it had been conducted under extraordinary circumstances. He said it was in response to concerning intelligence reports regarding human military expansion into contested sectors. He characterized the entire vote as a contingency planning exercise rather than an operational directive. He stated clearly that no actions had been authorized or taken against humanity. Commander Jake Russell listened to Vren's words and said flatly that the counselor was lying. Jake had seen the implementation plans with his own eyes. He had read the plague research documents and the military strike proposals and the economic warfare strategies. The stabilization protocol had moved far beyond hypothetical planning. They had been preparing for actual genocide. President Claire's response was swift and devastating. Within 1 hour of Vren's broadcast, she released everything that Jake's intelligence team had gathered. She made public the full stabilization protocol documents. She showed the galaxy the plague research that had been conducted. She revealed the military strike plans that detailed which colonies would be hit first. She exposed the economic warfare proposals designed to starve human settlements. She laid bare the complete scope of what the Council had been planning. Claire appeared on screen again for a second broadcast that day. Her voice was hard and filled with controlled anger. She addressed Vren's characterization directly. She said that Vren called it contingency planning, but she called it premeditated genocide. She pointed out that the council had not just discussed whether to eliminate humans. They had debated extensively about how to do it. They had argued about whether disease or starvation or orbital bombardment would be most cost-effective. They had treated mass murder as a budget problem. The galaxy reeled from these revelations. Public opinion across hundreds of worlds fractured along species lines and political divisions and moral boundaries. Some alien populations supported their government's actions completely. They argued that humanity was indeed dangerous and unpredictable and needed to be controlled or removed. However, many other aliens were genuinely horrified by what their leaders had planned. Mass protests erupted on the Delothian homeworld. Millions of citizens took to the streets demanding that their government formally condemn the council's actions. The Vex Collective experienced a major political split. Several crystal ships broke away to form an independent polity that rejected the council's authority entirely. The Karathi civilization faced internal crisis as their science caste formally declared separation from their military caste's command structure. Ambassador Lisa Grant worked desperately to capitalize on the chaos and division. She reached out to every species that had voted against the extinction measure or had chosen to abstain. She found receptive audiences among many groups. The Delothians agreed to formal talks about mutual defense. Several Vex factions expressed interest in forming a new political alliance. The Mirren Collective offered to mediate between humans and moderate council members. Even some Xanthir reached out privately. These were individuals who were appalled by Vren's actions and wanted to help prevent further escalation. Lisa reported her progress to President Claire in a secure communication. She told the president that humanity was not alone in this crisis. There were species across the galaxy who would stand with them against the Council's tyranny. The numbers were not enough to outnumber their enemies in direct confrontation. However, they were enough to make the Council think twice before taking action. They were enough to create political complications that might prevent war. Meanwhile, General Nathan Cole quietly positioned Earth's military assets for the worst possible scenario. The defense fleet dispersed from Earth to protect key colonies throughout human space. New orbital defense platforms came online weeks ahead of their original schedule. Deep in classified research facilities on Earth and Mars, scientists worked around the clock. They were developing weapons that could threaten even the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. Humanity was preparing for war while hoping for peace. Captain Daniel Brooks received new orders transmitted directly from Earth Command. The Valiant was to conduct diplomatic reconnaissance missions. His tasks included identifying potential allies among alien species and monitoring Council military movements for signs of aggression. He was to gather intelligence that might prove crucial in the coming conflict. Lieutenant Commander Gregg observed quietly that they were gathering intelligence for a war that might not actually come. Daniel replied grimly that they might also be preparing for a war that had already started. He suggested that humanity was just now realizing they had been under attack all along. The galaxy had fractured into opposing camps. The Council's darkest secret had been exposed to the light. Humanity stood at a crossroads facing civilizations that were millions of years older and far more powerful. The answers that everyone demanded were starting to emerge from the chaos. However, each answer only raised more urgent questions. Why had the vote happened in the first place? Who had really been behind the push for human extinction? Most urgently, what would happen next now that the secret was revealed? 3 weeks after the revelation, Ambassador Lisa Grant stood in an underground chamber on the neutral world of Sanctuary. This planet had been specifically designated for diplomatic meetings between parties in conflict, and it was considered sacred ground, where violence was absolutely forbidden. The chamber was carved from natural rock and lit by soft bioluminescent panels that cast a gentle glow across the space. Across from Lisa sat representatives from 23 different species. These were the ones who had voted against humanity's erasure, or had chosen to abstain from the vote entirely. The Delothian representative was a being named Torash who had silver fur covering, his body and intelligent eyes that showed genuine concern. He spoke first, and his words were translated through the universal communication system. He told Lisa that before they could discuss any formal alliance, they needed to understand the complete truth about humanity. He asked directly whether humans possessed weapons of mass destruction that were capable of threatening entire planets and populations. Lisa met his gaze steadily without flinching or looking away. She answered yes with complete honesty. She acknowledged that humanity did possess such weapons. However, she immediately pointed out that the Delothians also had such weapons. The Vex possessed them as well. The Karathi had them, and so did 47 other Council species. She stated that the real question was not whether humans had dangerous weapons. The important question was whether humanity had ever used those weapons without provocation against innocent populations. She paused for effect before continuing. She said that humans had not done so. She then asked whether the Council could honestly say the same thing, given that they had voted to use such weapons against humanity. A ripple of reaction went through the assembled alien representatives. The point had struck home with devastating accuracy. The Council had after all voted to use weapons of mass destruction against an entire species that had committed no aggressive acts. Resonance pattern. 7 was the Vex scientist who had sent files to Earth about the sabotage efforts. His crystalline body pulsed with thoughtful amber light as he spoke. He explained that the vote had been driven primarily by fear. More specifically, it was fear that had been carefully cultivated and encouraged by the eldest civilizations in the Council. He told Lisa that these ancient species saw humanity's rapid advancement as fundamentally destabilizing to the galactic order. In only 10,000 years, humans had progressed from primitive hunter-gatherers living in caves to a starfaring civilization that explored distant sectors. He pointed out that most species took 100,000 years or more to achieve that same level of development. Lisa asked if humanity was being punished simply for being successful and innovative. Torash corrected her gently. He said that humans were being feared for their potential rather than punished for their actions. He explained that the Council's entire power structure was built on a carefully maintained hierarchy. The ancient species held the most influence and made the important decisions. Newer and younger species were expected to accept their junior status and defer to their elders. However, humanity had refused to accept this natural order from the very beginning. Humans negotiated as equals with species millions of years older. They demanded respect rather than waiting patiently for it to be granted over centuries. They innovated and created new technologies rather than simply adopting existing ones from older civilizations. A representative from the Mirren collective named Keeper Vel spoke next. The Mirren were gelatinous beings who communicated through chemical signals that were translated by their equipment. Keeper Vel undulated in a motion that Lisa had learned was equivalent to a thoughtful nod. The Mirren explained that the eldest civilization saw humanity as children playing with dangerous fusion reactors. They viewed humans as unpredictable and reckless and needing to be controlled or removed before they caused catastrophic damage. Lisa leaned forward and made her appeal directly. She urged them to help humanity change the minds of these fearful ancient species. She proposed that they form a coalition together. This alliance could demand that the Council formally rescind the extinction vote. They could require a public apology and guarantees of humanity's sovereignty and right to exist. Working together, they could create enough political pressure to force change. A small reptilian delegate from the Saran Compact asked the obvious question. What would happen if the Council refused their demands? What would they do if the eldest species simply ignored them? Lisa's answer was simple and direct. She said that humanity would defend itself by any means necessary. However, she emphasized that they would much rather have allies than enemies. They preferred cooperation to conflict. Over the next several hours, they hammered out the details of what would become known as the Sanctuary Coalition. Representatives debated specific terms and conditions. They discussed military cooperation and economic support and political coordination. By the end of the session, 23 species representing billions of individual beings had formally aligned themselves with humanity. They stood together against the Council's genocidal vote and the tyranny of the eldest civilizations. The coalition was not large, enough to outweigh the Council's full military might in direct confrontation. However, it was significant enough to make any intervention extremely costly, both militarily and politically. The Council could no longer act against humanity without facing serious consequences. Back on Earth, Commander Jake Russell presented President Claire with his latest intelligence analysis. He stood before her desk in the secure briefing room with data tablets and holographic projections ready. Jake reported that the Galactic Council was fracturing from within. Councillor Vren's faction still pushed aggressively for the stabilization protocol to be implemented. However, they had lost considerable momentum and support. The public exposure of their plans had cost them backing among moderate species who found genocide morally unacceptable. Vren's group was now arguing for a different approach, which they called formal containment. President Claire asked what exactly containment meant in this context. Jake explained that it involved economic and territorial sanctions against humanity. The Council wanted to restrict humans to their current colonies with no expansion permitted. They would ban humanity from exploring new sectors of space. They would limit human access to advanced technologies. Most controversially, they wanted to place Council observers on all human worlds with authority to monitor and report on everything humans did. Jake pointed out that it was not genocide, but it was definitely a cage that would slowly strangle human civilization. Claire responded bitterly that the Council would present this as a reasonable compromise. She said they would frame it as a choice between giving up freedom or facing total extinction. She noted that it was not really much of a choice at all. However, Jake countered that it was also a significant opening for negotiation. The fact that the Council was willing to negotiate at all meant something important. It indicated that they were not confident they could simply eliminate humanity without serious consequences. The Sanctuary Coalition and humanity's military buildup and the intense public attention had all combined to make the Council hesitate. Their strategy was working even if the threat had not completely disappeared. At that moment, Admiral Kyle Murphy entered the briefing room with urgent news that changed everything. He told President Claire that their deep space sensors had detected a massive Council fleet forming near the Aldebaran Nexus. The preliminary scans showed at least 200 capital ships from 30 different species. All of them were operating under unified command structure, which was extremely unusual. This was not a normal patrol or trading convoy. The room fell completely silent as everyone processed this information. General Nathan Cole spoke grimly. He stated flatly that this was not a negotiating position, that many warships gathered in one place with unified command could only mean one thing. It was an invasion force being prepared for military action. Claire's face became hard as stone. She asked how long it would take for that fleet to reach Earth. Admiral Kyle calculated quickly and replied that at standard cruising speed it would take approximately 3 weeks. However, if they pushed their faster-than-light drives to maximum capacity, they could arrive in as little as 10 days. Claire stood and walked to the large window that overlooked the city of Geneva far below. Outside, ordinary people went about their daily lives completely unaware that an armada was forming to threaten their entire civilization. She watched them for a moment before turning back to her advisors with determination in her eyes. She gave clear orders to each person in rapid succession. She told General Nathan to immediately move their entire defense fleet into defensive positions around Earth and Mars and all the major colonies. She ordered Admiral Kyle to coordinate with their coalition partners. She wanted to know if any of them were willing to provide actual military support, rather than just political backing. She told Commander Jake that she needed detailed intelligence on that fleet. She wanted to know who was commanding it and what their exact orders were, and what their rules of engagement might be. Claire then noted that Ambassador Lisa was still at Sanctuary negotiating with their potential allies. She ordered her communications staff to get this new information to Lisa immediately. The coalition needed to know that the Council was preparing for possible military action. As her team moved quickly to execute her orders, Claire allowed herself one brief moment of fear. They had successfully built their coalition. They had gathered crucial intelligence. They had prepared their defenses as best they could. However, the question remained whether any of it would be enough to prevent war. The Council had assembled an overwhelming force. Humanity's survival now depended on whether they could make the Council blink first or whether courage and unity would be sufficient to face civilizations millions of years older than their own. On the valiant Captain Daniel Brooks received new orders transmitted on secure channels. He was to take a small fleet of Earth's fastest reconnaissance ships and conduct close observation of the Council Armada. His mission was to determine their exact capabilities and identify any weaknesses, and most importantly assess their true intentions. Were they preparing to actually attack, or was this another intimidation tactic? As his ship jumped into faster than light speed, Lieutenant Maya Johnson looked over at Daniel. She asked if he really thought the Council would launch an attack against them. Daniel watched the stars streak past the view screen. He answered that he believed the Council was trying to make humanity surrender without fighting. They were showing overwhelming force and hoping humans would give up when faced with impossible odds. Maya asked what would happen if humanity refused to back down. Daniel's jaw set firmly as he replied that humanity would show the galaxy why their species had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars and the cold void of space. They would demonstrate that humans did not go extinct easily no matter who tried to eliminate them. The Council's armada hung in space like a massive steel constellation. 200 warships from 30 different species were arranged in a formation specifically designed to intimidate anyone who saw it. At the heart of this fleet was the Judgment, which was a massive Karathi dreadnought that stretched over 2 kilometers in length. The ship was commanded by Fleet Admiral Kresh, who was a senior member of the Karathi military, caste and a strong supporter of the stabilization protocol. Captain Daniel Brooks brought the Valiant out of faster-than-light travel, at the very edge of the fleet's sensor range. His small reconnaissance group consisted of only 8 human ships, but they were the fastest vessels in Earth's fleet. They maintained strict electronic silence as they observed the massive armada before them. Lieutenant Maya Johnson whispered as she looked at her tactical display. She said it was enough firepower to destroy 100 planets. The numbers on her screen showed weapon systems and shield strengths that were absolutely overwhelming. However, Lieutenant Commander Greg Patterson studied the data more carefully. He pointed out that the fleet composition was revealing. The ships were heavily Karathi and Xanthir, but he was not seeing any Delothian signatures in the formation. There were no Vex crystal ships either. The coalition species that had aligned with humanity were not participating in this show of force. Daniel studied the fleet formations with his experienced tactical eye. He noticed something important about how the ships were positioned. They were arranged for maximum visual intimidation, but not for actual combat efficiency. The capital ships were positioned too close together. In a real battle, they would interfere with each other's firing solutions and maneuvering space. This was meant to scare humanity into submission, rather than prepare for actual fighting. Back on Earth, President Claire Anderson stood in the Crisis Command Center surrounded by her military and civilian advisors. The holographic display in the center of the room showed both the Council Armada and humanity's defensive positions around their key worlds. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Admiral Kyle Murphy reported that the Council had sent an official message to Earth. They were demanding that humanity accept full Council supervision of their civilization. The terms included permanent observers stationed on all human worlds. There would be strict restrictions on military development and expansion. Humanity would have to submit to territorial limitations that would confine them to their current colonies. They would be forbidden from exploring new sectors without Council permission. General Nathan Cole muttered that it was slavery with extra steps. The terms would effectively turn humanity into a vassal state with no real sovereignty or freedom to determine their own future. Ambassador Lisa Grant's face appeared on screen as she transmitted from the neutral world of Sanctuary. She told President Claire that the coalition was holding together despite the pressure. 23 species had formally declared their position. They stated that any Council action against humanity without just cause would be considered a violation of galactic law. Just cause meant an actual aggressive act committed by humans rather than mere fear of what humans might do in the future. Several coalition species had moved their own fleets into defensive positions. Claire observed that the coalition was not joining humanity, but they were not opposing them either. Lisa explained that it was actually more significant than simple neutrality. The Delothians had cut off the Council's access to their major trade routes. The Vex Collective had placed an embargo on advanced computing technologies that many Council species depended on. The Mirren had frozen financial assets and blocked transactions. They were applying economic and political pressure without firing a single shot. Commander Jake Russell looked up from his intelligence terminal with urgent news. He reported that he was intercepting communications between Council species. They were arguing among themselves about the situation. The moderate factions were demanding negotiation rather than military confrontation. Several species were threatening to withdraw their ships from the Armada entirely. The unified front that the Council wanted to present was cracking under internal pressure. Claire allowed herself a small spark of hope, but she knew they were not safe yet. The situation could still escalate into violence at any moment. Councillor Vren's face appeared on the main communication screen. His insectoid features were as unreadable as ever. He addressed President Claire directly and told her that she had placed the galaxy in an impossible position. He claimed that humanity's refusal to accept reasonable supervision left the Council with no choice but to enforce compliance through military means. Claire straightened in her chair and met Vren's gaze through the screen. She responded that Vren had voted to exterminate her entire species. The Council had planned the genocide in secret chambers. They had debated different methods of mass murder. They had allocated resources for humanity's destruction. She asked how he could possibly call supervision reasonable after that. She asked how he could call compliance an option when the alternative was extinction. Vren replied coldly that they had acted to preserve galactic stability. His tone suggested that he truly believed this justified everything the Council had planned. Claire shot back that they had acted to preserve their own power. She stated clearly that humanity's real crime was not being dangerous. Their crime was being unwilling to accept an inferior status in the Council's hierarchy. Humans were advancing too quickly and asking too many questions and demanding too much respect. That was what truly threatened the Council leadership. She leaned forward toward the screen and continued. She told Vren that he had not anticipated one crucial thing. Humanity was no longer alone in this conflict. 23 species had rejected the Council's authority on this matter. Dozens more were questioning the Council's judgment and legitimacy. Vren was not facing just humanity anymore. He was facing everyone in the galaxy who was tired of the eldest civilizations dictating who deserved to exist and who did not. On the Judgment Fleet, Admiral Kresh received troubling reports from his ship commanders. 3 species had withdrawn their vessels from the Armada without authorization or explanation. 2 more were requesting clarification of mission parameters and rules of engagement. The unified front that was supposed to intimidate humanity was falling apart. His communications officers reported that Councillor Vren was demanding that he attack immediately. However, half the Council was sending contradictory orders telling him to stand down and return to Council space. Kresh found himself thinking about his mate back on the Karathi homeworld. She was a respected member of the science cast, and she had begged him not to participate in this mission. She had called it madness and predicted that it would tear their civilization apart. He thought about the galaxy he would leave to his offspring if this situation escalated into full-scale war. Multiple species fighting across dozens of sectors would destabilize everything. Kresh made his decision. He gave orders to his fleet in a firm voice that allowed no argument. He told all ships to stand down their weapon systems. He ordered the entire Armada to return to Council space, immediately. Across the galaxy, billions of beings watched through various communication networks as the massive Armada began to disperse. Without firing a single shot, ships broke formation and turned toward their home territories. The standoff was over without any shots being fired or lives being lost. In the weeks and months that followed, the Galactic Council underwent its most significant restructuring in recorded history. Councillor Vren was removed from office and faced charges of conspiracy and abuse of authority. The stabilization protocol was formally disbanded and all its records were made public. New oversight mechanisms were established to prevent such secret votes from happening again. Humanity did not win everything they had hoped for in the negotiations that followed. The talks were long and difficult and often contentious. However, they won what mattered most, which was recognition as a sovereign species with the full right to chart their own course among the stars. They gained respect and equal status rather than subservience. The Sanctuary Coalition evolved into a permanent political body. It became a counterweight to the eldest civilization's traditional dominance of galactic affairs. 23 species became 40 and then 60 as others joined this alliance of younger civilizations demanding reform and fair treatment. Captain Daniel Brooks stood on the Valiant's bridge as they approached Earth. The blue and green planet grew larger in the view screen. Lieutenant Maya Johnson sat at her communication station and smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. She said quietly that they had really survived this crisis. Lieutenant Commander Greg replied that they had done more than just survive. They had changed the entire galaxy's political structure. Daniel thought about Krell, the young Xanthier who had died to expose the truth about the vote. He thought about the coalition species who had stood with humanity despite the risks to themselves. He thought about President Claire who had faced down an armada and refused to surrender. He thought about all the humans across dozens of worlds who had stood together when faced with extinction. Daniel spoke quietly as he watched Earth turn peacefully in space. He said the galaxy had wanted answers about the secret vote. Humanity had given them one very clear answer. Humans did not go extinct easily. They did not submit or surrender their freedom easily either. When someone tried to erase them from existence, they made certain that the entire galaxy knew about it and faced the consequences. Below them, Earth continued, its eternal rotation completely, unaware of how close it had come to annihilation. However, humanity would never be caught unprepared again. The secret vote had been exposed to the light. The planned genocide had been prevented through courage and unity. Humanity had claimed their rightful place among the stars not as subjects or subordinates, but as equals, who had earned their status through determination. The Council had voted for humanity's erasure. Humanity had voted to survive and thrive. In the end, that was the only answer that truly mattered.